Good morning. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the Board, and today is Wednesday, August 2nd at 9:32 a.m., and the workshop's called to order. With me today are, to my left, Board Member Didi Diadamo, to my right, Board Members Tam Dodak and Joaquin Esquivel. Mr. Lawford, will you introduce the staff that's assisting today?
Sure. On my right, I have Chief Deputies John Bishop and Eric Oppenheimer. Clerk to the Board Janine Townsend is assisting today, as well as Courtney Tyler.
Thank you very much. For those of you who aren't familiar with our procedures, the emergency evacuation Instructions for this building are, when you hear a sound, look now for the exit nearest you. When you hear an emergency sound, it definitely sounds like an emergency sound. Pick up your stuff and take your friends, and please proceed carefully down the stairs. If you need assistance, someone will help you to a protected area on this floor. We go meet near our assembly area is near J and 10th Street. If you want to wait with us for the all clear, that's great. Obviously, you can go wherever you'd like. The workshop is being webcast and recorded, so please be sure when you come up to the microphone that you speak into it. It's adjustable, if you're tall, move it up so you don't have to bend over, and likewise, bring it down. It's important to be close enough that it gets picked up so that people can hear you in the back of the room and over the web. Please check and double check any noise-making devices and put them on silent, stun, or off. And that's the basics. Now we're on to item number 10. This is a workshop, not an action item, but it is obviously a big issue of tremendous importance all around to a lot of people. Staff have been working very diligently to try and deal with the big task that has been set before them to deal with both the water rights and water quality issues, and to try and do it in a timely way to also facilitate implementation of the Act. And so as we do, some of you are not familiar with our procedures. The workshops are very helpful, not just for us, but for you to understand what it is that's being proposed, so that as you put in your comments to us, you can focus on what we are actually proposing. It's also helpful for us to hear from you to get that first blush of what the concerns are, suggestions, other things that staff can start taking into account as we consider it. We never think of our proposals as perfection in proposals, and those of you who have seen us work over the years know that we read everything and take it very seriously, and the staff does as well, and we make changes in response to thoughtful and helpful comments. I want to invite you to help us make this as effective as we can, starting with today, but certainly going through the comment period. And we're all on a relatively tight time frame, as I know everyone is acutely aware, so us working together. Is that grammatically correct? Working together is probably the best way to go, and it's what we prefer, so please engage. With that, I'll turn it over to, do you want to introduce it?
Yeah, I'll do a very brief introduction.
Ms. Ragazzi will.
As all of our members know, and as I suspect everybody listening online and in the room right now are aware, the State Board is in the middle of developing a statewide regulatory program for cannabis cultivation. In that program, we are attempting to build off the prior efforts of the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, as well as the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board. On July 7th, the board staff released a draft cannabis cultivation policy and principles and guidelines for the cannabis cultivation, along with general waste discharge requirements for discharges of waste associated with the cultivation of cannabis. The notice was provided with information regarding the board's plan to consider adoption, as Ms. Marcus indicated, on an expedited schedule in order to meet the requirements of the legislation and initiative effort that had been approved by California's voters. Currently, the plan is to adopt or consider adoption of the policy and general waste discharge requirements in October of this year. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Ragazzi, who will go ahead and introduce the staff who are presenting this item today.
Good morning. Thank you, Acting Director Lawfer, Chair Marcus, and members of the board. Happy to be here today to talk about the draft cannabis policy staff report in general order. We have a large contingent up here today that reflects the diverse groups of folks that have worked together to bring this policy in general order to you today, so you can hear comments from folks and get a little bit of background on it. So Erin Ragazzi, I'm in the Division of Water Rights here at the State Water Board, starting at your far right, my far left. Shala Faranock, Assistant Deputy Director of the Division of Water Quality. Next in line, Tim O'Brien, Senior Overseeing Development of the General Order. Next in line, Tim Regan with the Office of Chief Counsel. To my right, Dan Schultz, Senior overseeing the development of the draft cannabis policy and staff report. To Dan's right, Lily Weaver, Office of Chief Counsel, Yvonne West, Office of Enforcement, and Andrew Derringer with the Office of Chief Counsel as well. So we have a lot of folks that have had input into the development of this. And then we are having this workshop transcribed. Peter Petty is here this morning to transcribe the meeting for us. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
Great, and I'll just mention, depending on how long we go, we'll have a mid-morning break and some kind of a lunch break.
So as Director Laufer noted, we released the draft policy, staff report, and general order for public comment on July 7th. It's out for a 60-day public comment period that concludes on September 6th at noon. We've held 2 staff information workshops on July 20th and 27th in Eureka and Sacramento to provide information on the policy, staff report, and general order. Much of what you'll see today is the same presentation. There's a little bit added with respect to background in outreach and coordination. And as mentioned, we're planning to bring this before the board for consideration on October 17th. The presentations that we provided for those 2 staff information workshops are posted on our website, and the presentation that's provided today will also be posted on the website later this morning. So what we're going to cover this morning is background, a little bit on the Water Board's responsibilities and how we ended up here today, discussion of potential impacts associated with cannabis cultivation activities, and then an overview of the draft policy and staff report. Dan's going to provide that overview of the impacts in the policy and staff report, and then Tim's going to cover the draft cannabis general order, Tim O'Brien, and then I'll wrap up with a small irrigation and use registration.
All right, it's a hefty package, so do you just have it, just so folks in the audience can know, I'm not going to hold you to it, but an estimate of how long the presentation is?
It's
so
probably
folks can sit
between
back.
30 and 40 realistically.
Okay. Take what you need. I mean, the objective is clarity.
Right. So in terms of background, back in 2015, 3 bills were passed that created the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act. And those were sort of the building blocks that created the medical cannabis regulatory program. That was augmented in 2016 by Senate Bill 837, and that was cleanup language to those 3 bills, but also provided many new authorities associated with the development of the policy that we're going to get into today. Then later in November of 2016, Prop 64 was passed. That brought recreational cannabis into the fold. And then most recently in June of this year, Senate Bill 94 was passed, and that's what consolidated all of the provisions for medical and recreational cannabis in the Medicinal and Adult Use Cannabis Regulations and Safety Act. So I'm going to provide a little bit of background of some of the key authorities that we're going to be discussing here today. The first one deals with the State Water Board. Under the original 3 bills, and was cleaned up slightly in SB 94, basically the State Water Board or appropriate regional board are required to address discharges of waste resulting from cannabis cultivation and have associated permitting activities such as development of waste discharge requirements, which is what the general order does. Then in Senate Bill 837, we got authority to work with the California Department of Food and Agriculture and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to ensure that the individual and cumulative effects of diversion and discharge, so water quality and flow-related elements, do not affect cannabis cultivation in stream flows needed for fish spawning, migration, and rearing, and then the need to maintain natural flow variability. Oops. Taking that a little bit further, SB 837 also provides the Water Board with authority to develop a policy for water quality control. And for folks that aren't familiar with our lingo, a policy for water quality control is equivalent to a regulation. So it's the Water Board's form of a regulation. And what it says is that the Water Board can develop interim and long-term principles and guidelines principles and guidelines is a fancy word for requirements for cannabis cultivation. And so the types of requirements that might be included are those that place limits on the amount of diversions that can take place, screening requirements, fish screening, yes, fish screening, to make sure, or passage, as well as the elimination of barriers, which would provide for passage. So those are some of the more diversion-oriented type of things. And then, of course, we've got the traditional water quality provisions associated with the requirements. There are two unique aspects of SB 837, and those are that our authority extends to springs, wetlands, and aquatic habitat. So when I say unique, when we get to the water rights side of things, sometimes springs are not covered if people claim that they don't flow off their property. In this case, springs are covered as part of the overall policy, and the requirements apply to springs, all springs. And Dan will get into that a little bit later. The other provision is that it specifically says that we may include requirements for groundwater extraction, and we do have provisions in the policy that cover groundwater as well, and Dan will cover those as well. I should mention that we have a Class 8 CEQA exemption associated with development of the policy, and so we're categorically exempt from CEQA. And the other important thing to mention is that this contemplates interim and long-term principles and guidelines. So this is our first policy. It recognizes that this is going to be updated. This is a totally new program. We recognize we're not going to get it spot on right out of the gate, and it's going to need to be revised and updated as we learn more, and the requirements will be adapted accordingly. So the legislature saw that that was the case, and it is envisioned that we will be bringing this back to the board. I would envision at least on an annual basis initially, until we have our feet really wet and we know what we're doing more, and then we won't have to come back as frequently. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to cover impacts.
Okay, so this photo provides a good picture of what cannabis cultivation sites look like from the air. There are two main types of impacts, environmental impacts associated with cannabis cultivation. There are both site-specific impacts and then also cumulative impacts when the cannabis cultivation sites are densely spaced, kind of like we see in this photo here. If you take those sites and start to look at it at the watershed scale, you can really start to see the potential for cumulative impacts. This is a map of two small watersheds in the Eel River watershed, taken from a 2015 study by California Department of Fish and Wildlife. The study looked at 4 small watersheds and found that the acreage of cannabis cultivation from 2009 to 2012 nearly doubled to more than 2,000 cannabis cultivation sites in those 4 small watersheds alone. So on this map, each of the bluish colored circles, which almost look white, are greenhouses, and then the red circles are outdoor cultivation sites. And the larger the circle is, the larger the number of cultivation plants being cultivated. So the policy in general order include requirements to address both the site-specific impacts and the cumulative impacts of cannabis cultivation. So now we'll go into a brief overview of some of the more specific impacts associated with cannabis cultivation. Currently, many of these cultivation sites are located in remote areas. And in order to access those areas, cannabis cultivators need to develop new roads or to modify older existing roads. If the access roads and cultivation site are not developed and maintained with appropriate best management practices, loose sediment runs off those sites during storm events and enters into the streams. Other potential water quality issues include fertilizers, pesticides, and other hazardous chemicals used at these sites, which can contaminate streams. Garbage from cannabis growing operations also can enter into the streams, and some cultivation sites do not have proper human waste disposal. There are also impacts to aquatic habitat and in-stream flows from water diversions. These typically result from the individual and cumulative effects of water diversions, which can, especially during the dry season, dry up the stream or completely dewater it and reduce the hydrologic connectivity, which is for juvenile salmonids. They need some ability to move between some of the habitats, and also the hydrologic connectivity provides for cooler temperatures, dissolved oxygen, and food supply. So this represents just some of the impacts that can occur from cannabis cultivation sites. There are many cultivation sites that have been implementing appropriate pest management practices and also are improving their current site conditions to bring them up to improve the environmental, to minimize the environmental impacts. The policy in general order established requirements for cannabis cultivation to protect in-stream flows and water quality in the state's water bodies and bring cultivation sites into compliance with more protective standards. So the requirements established in the policy will be incorporated into 2 permits issued by the State Water Board, the General Order Waste Discharge Regulatory Program, and also the Small Irrigation Use Registration Program. The requirements in the policy will also be included as conditions as part of the California Department of Food and Agriculture's Cal Cannabis Cultivation Licensing Program. The focus of this presentation is on the documents that are out for public comment, which are the Draft Cannabis Policy and Staff Report and the Draft Cannabis General Order. The policy describes the overall structure of the board's proposed cannabis cultivation regulatory program and the water quality and in-stream flow requirements. The staff report provides background information and the rationale for the requirements in the policy. And then the Draft Cannabis General Order includes the tier structure, fee structure, and environmental management plans. So the cannabis cultivation policy is broken up into 3 main sections. There's the main document, then there's Attachment A and Attachment B. Attachment A is highlighted in green to bring attention to the fact that these requirements are established in the policy and then duplicated in the general order. So the requirements in Attachment A in the policy are the exact same as the requirements in Attachment A of the general order. The cannabis policy and associated requirements are only applicable to cannabis cultivation and are specifically developed to address the issues required in cannabis legislation. The policy applies to commercial cultivation for either recreational or medical use and to personal cultivation for medical use. It does not apply to personal cultivation for recreational use, which is the 6 plants or less. The policy was developed in consultation with the regional water boards, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Food and Agriculture, Department of Pesticide Regulation, as well as various other divisions within the State Water Board and Office of Enforcement. So the cannabis cultivation policy, the main document, provides the overview of the Water Board's program and context for how it fits in with other cannabis regulatory programs. It establishes 14 regions throughout the state for in-stream flow requirements. And the cannabis policy, as Aaron mentioned, can be updated as necessary to address localized impacts in areas with high resource value and high density cannabis cultivation. The policy, it also describes how the policy will be enforced. And the policy also provides for local cooperative solutions, which I will go into more detail a little later. So this is a map of the 14 regional boundaries that are established in the policy throughout the state. We kind of consider these kind of our management units for both the development and in-stream flows and future efforts as we move forward and start to look at a more regional basis under the development of more long-term requirements. So under the Water Code, the State Water Board has the primary enforcement authority for the requirements developed in the policy. And also, if we take any enforcement actions, we shall notify California Department of Food and Agriculture of those enforcement actions. Enforcement of the policy requirements will be handled through various Water Board authorities, including water rights, water quality, and public trust. Appropriate penalties and other consequences for violations will help prevent cultivators that do not comply with requirements from obtaining an unfair competitive advantage and help ensure public confidence in the regulatory framework. Existing enforcement efforts, such as the Watershed Enforcement Team, will continue, and the State Water Board is working to expand these efforts to additional locations throughout the state. So in Attachment A, Section 1, is the general requirements and prohibitions, which are the rules and authorities that are applicable to all cannabis cultivators, including compliance with applicable state and local laws, forest practice rules where applicable, and also a requirement to check with California Department of Fish and Wildlife to determine whether or not a lake and stream bed alteration agreement is needed for the activity. There's also right of access by agencies to inspect for compliance, laws about tribal lands and cultural resources, general water quality rules such as riparian setbacks and limitations on slope of land being disturbed. And the policy also provides for a general water quality certification, but it does require submittal of information and approval by the regional board executive officer prior to commencing work under that general water quality certification. And they may also add additional conditions at that time. Oh, wait, one too many. Sorry about that. So Section 2 of Attachment A contains the water diversion and waste discharge requirements. Many of these are considered best practical treatment and control measures, best management practices, or standard conditions for the protection of water quality. Specific requirements for cultivation activities include general erosion control measures for the entire cultivation site, stream crossings and installations, culverts and road development, management of fertilizers, pesticides, and petroleum, cleanup, restoration, and mitigation on existing sites, proper soil, cultivation, human waste disposal, control of irrigation runoff, and appropriate methods of water diversion and storage, which includes a maximum diversion rate of 10 gallons per minute unless it's otherwise approved in an existing water right. And it also includes winterization measures. Section 3 includes the narrative and numeric flow requirements, gauge requirements, groundwater requirements, and requirements for fully contained springs. Under the narrative flow requirements, there is a 50% bypass of stream flow past the point of diversion. This is a visual bypass. And as Aaron mentioned earlier, diversions from water bodies include diversions from springs. There is also a surface water forbearance period from April 1st through October 31st. And forbearance means a period where you cannot divert water. After November 1st, prior to commencing diversions, the flow requirement at the compliance gauge must be met for 7 consecutive days to divert water before December 15th. From December 15th to March 31st, diversions may occur whenever in-stream flows are above the minimum flows at the compliance gauge. The numeric in-stream flow and flow requirements and gauging requirements include compliance gauges that are listed in the policy. So those compliance gauges are listed in Section 4, which we'll go to in just a second, and there's numeric flow requirements at each of those gauges. And diversions, as I mentioned, can only occur when daily average flow at the assigned gauge is above the minimum in-stream flow requirement. The diverters shall measure and record daily water diversion and use, and there's also gauge installation requirements for additional gauges used for compliance with the numeric flow requirement. The deputy director may require installation of a gauge if the assigned gauge in Section 4 does not adequately represent local water demand. So this is going to be adaptively managed as we move forward and start to see where there's significant cultivation activity and significant demand for water. Additionally, under the local cooperative solutions, if the cannabis cultivators believe that there is more water available in their watershed than is reflected at the compliance gauge, they may form a local cooperative and request to report to a different existing gauge that was not considered in Section 4 that meets the gauging requirements, or they can install their own gauge to the standards of the gauging requirements. In addition, under the local cooperative solutions, cannabis cultivators may request for an alternative flow requirement if the California Department of Fish and Wildlife determines that the proposed flow requirement that they develop will be as protective or more protective than those developed in the policy. Sorry about that. So at this time, there are not any groundwater diversion limitations. However, the policy does lay out some potential triggers that may lead to development of additional groundwater requirements. Policy establishes in-stream low flow thresholds during the dry season at the compliance gauges as one mechanism to help monitor whether groundwater diverters are having a cumulative negative impact on in-stream flows. And additional triggers include, but are not limited to, significant numbers of groundwater diversions or significant numbers of surface water diversions switching to groundwater in a localized area that have the potential to impact surface flow. If the State Water Board determines that groundwater diversions have the potential to impact surface flow, the board would notify groundwater diverters of a possible groundwater forbearance period or other requirements, so the cultivators could take measures to secure alternative water supplies or identify other measures such as storage to address low flow conditions. So springs that do not run off a property, which would be considered fully contained springs, in the absence of diversion and do not have subsurface or subsurface hydrologic connectivity at any time of the year during all water year types may request that the 50% bypass requirement be waived. The policy does require cannabis cultivators who claim to have a fully contained spring to submit substantial evidence to document that the spring meets the policy requirements. Additional information on the type of information that may need to be submitted and the professional expertise required to make the request is discussed in further detail in this section of the policy. And I also want to point out that fully contained springs are still subject to the forbearance period, and the ability to divert is still limited to the numeric flow requirement being met during the diversion season at the assigned compliance gauge. Section 4 contains the watershed compliance gauge assignments, and the compliance gauges are broken out in Section 4 by the regions that were on the map that we saw before. So the policy establishes minimum monthly flows at the compliance gauges. The watershed areas without existing gauges are then assigned a compliance gauge for a different location in the same watershed or a nearby watershed with similar flow characteristics. During the diversion season, cannabis cultivators are required to check their compliance gauge assignment at least daily and prior to diverting to ensure that water is available to divert at the assigned gauge. And the compliance gauges may assign over time as we add more gauges to the system. Also, the State Water Board is developing a web page to provide information on which, to make it easy for the cannabis cultivator to determine which compliance gauge they're assigned to. And we're also looking to develop a more streamlined checking opportunity for the cannabis cultivators where they can easily go on and it will just be more of like a red or a green to let them know if they can divert so they don't have to try to figure out what the gauge is saying, and it does it automatically for them. So Section 5 specifies the plans and reports that are needed as part of the general order. And those include the site management plan, erosion and sediment control plan, nitrogen management plan, site closure plan, and site closure plan. And there's going to be more detail on these plans in the general order, and Mr. O'Brien will cover some of those as well. Section 6 includes useful guidance documents and includes links to helpful water quality facts and documents and best management practices. And attachment B is the glossary of technical terms used in the policy. The cannabis staff report includes an overview of the policy regions, background information on legislation and regulations, background and rationale for the policy requirements, in-stream flow engaging requirements, compliance, gauge assignments, including the methodology we use to assign the gauges, and also includes the water quality anti-degradation analysis. And now I'll turn it over to Mr. O'Brien with the Division of Water Quality to discuss the general order in more detail.
Okay, thank you. We have developed the general WDRs to implement the requirements of the principles and guidelines, mainly for outdoor cultivation activities. And it'll only address legal cultivation sites, and primarily concern is water quality. The order recognizes other permitting requirements that apply, but does not implement those requirements. And if applicable, will require water rights compliance, but a water right isn't included in the general order. So why do this? Well, cannabis cultivation has grown exponentially, and it's often located in sensitive areas. Prop 215 initiated the legal cultivation activities, and Prop 64 is expected to greatly increase that activity. It's been estimated that as many as 50,000 cultivation sites exist in the site, and a California Department of Food and Agriculture survey in August of 2016 indicated as many as 16,000 licenses, cannabis cultivation licenses, would be sought from that agency. CDFA will begin issuing cultivation licenses on January 1st, 2018, and that license will require compliance with the Water Board's requirements. Many of the regional water boards will need to provide coverage, but they don't have an existing order, so the statewide general order addresses that need. So as I mentioned, some of the regions don't have it. There's two regions that do have orders, the North Coast and the Central Valley. So when we started developing our order, we generally based it on the North Coast and the Central Valley existing orders that were developed in 2015. North Coast has about 765 enrollees, and Central Valley has about 659 enrollees. our general order requires coverage based on the threat to water quality. And we took a tiered approach that's based on disturbed area and risk. And the risk is based on site-specific conditions. And there's conditional exemptions that may apply for some cultivation activities. But all dischargers must comply with the applicable requirements in Attachment A of the cannabis cultivation policy. I'm going to talk just briefly about each of these discharger classifications, and I'll talk about them in more detail. The personal use exemption is what Dan mentioned earlier, the 6 plants. There's also a medical marijuana exemption. We have imposed the additional requirement of less than 1,000 square feet of disturbed area, comply with setbacks, SOAP requirements, etc. Conditionally exempt, that's the smallest of the commercial activities. Those are dischargers that will have to seek a CDFA cultivation license. They are limited to 2,000 square feet disturbed area. Tier 1 is a commercial activity. They are allowed to disturb between 2,000 square feet and less than 1 acre. And Tier 2 are the largest of the commercial grows. That's a disturbed area greater than 1 acre. So as I mentioned, the personal use exemption is exempt from the CDFA licensing requirements. It's not a commercial activity. It addresses the recreational cultivation of cannabis, up to 6 plants per property parcel. And it also addresses the medical exemption up to 100 square feet per patient, 100 square feet of canopy area per patient. Or if you're a caregiver cultivating for patients, you can cultivate for a maximum of 5 patients. So you have a 500 square foot canopy area. Under personal use exemption, we limit it to a 1,000 square feet disturbed area and a 20% slope. We want the cultivation to be contiguous, all located in one area, comply with setback requirements, implement all the requirements of Attachment A in the cannabis cultivation policy, which is the exact same Attachment A in the general order. Coalitions or cooperatives cannot claim the exemption. And if you're a personal use exemption, you don't have to register or enroll under the general order. Conditional exemption is for cultivators that produce commercial cannabis, either medical or recreational. They need a CDFA cultivation license. They're allowed to disturb up to 2,000 square feet and can be located on a 20% slope. Again, contiguous cultivation area, comply with setback requirements, implement all the requirements in Attachment A, and conditional exemption cultivators will register under the general order. Tier 1 or Tier 2 enrollees are the larger commercial cannabis cultivators. They produce commercial cannabis, medical or recreational. They need the CDFA license. A Tier 1 determination is based on the tier determination is based on the disturbed area. Tier 1, as I mentioned before, is between 2,000 square feet and less than 1 acre. Tier 2 disturbs more than 1 acre. Again, they comply with setback requirements, and implement all the requirements of Attachment A. And for Tier 1 or Tier 2 enrollees, dischargers, they have to enroll under the general order. So as I had mentioned, there are some site-specific conditions that we use in our evaluation of the risk of the site. So for low risk, and this only applies to Tier 1 or Tier 2 enrollees, for low risk, no portion of the disturbed area is located on a slope greater than 30%, and they comply with all the disturbed area or with all the setback requirements. For moderate risk, any portion of the disturbed area is located on a slope greater than 30%, and all of the disturbed area complies with the setback requirements. And the highest risk sites are sites where any portion of the disturbed area is located within the setback requirements. So we've developed a registration and enrollment process, and so I'll just go through the phases here. The applicant goes online, it's internet-based. They enter information. The system prompts them with questions. They answer water quality and water rights questions. And the applicant, at the time of application, self-certifies compliance with Attachment A in the implementation schedule. Remember, I said they have to comply with all of that. They self-certify that they're doing that. So the survey wizard, what we're calling the application process, generates for the applicant a notice of receipt with a fee invoice, and it stores the information for a later upload into the state databases, California Integrated Water Quality System, and the Electronic Water Rights Information System. Then the applicant has 30 days to pay the fee. They pay that at the Regional Water Board, and the Regional Water Board sends a notice of applicability to the applicant and adds the technical report requirements, which I'll talk about in a minute, based on the site conditions to the discharger. And then the Regional Water Board staff reviews the reports for compliance and inspects the facilities and answers any applicant questions that come up. So the order does have some reporting requirements. Conditionally exempt dischargers are, remember, they just register, they don't enroll. So the only thing that they have to do is if they decide to stop cultivating cannabis or they want to stop the coverage under the order, they have to file a site closure report. For Tier 1 or Tier 2 dischargers, they have to submit reports based on the threat to water quality, the low, moderate, or high risk. So if you, all the sites will have a low risk requirement. They all have to submit the site management plan and the site closure plan sometime if they stop cultivating. Site management plan basically just says, how are you going to comply with the requirements in attachment A? Then moderate risk, that's for the facilities that are located on a slope greater than 30%. They have to prepare a site erosion sediment control plan. And high risk are the ones that are located within the setbacks. They have to submit a disturbed area stabilization plan. How are they going to comply and get out of those setbacks? And then for the largest facilities that have a cultivation area, which is different than disturbed area, greater than 1 acre, they have an additional requirement, a nitrogen management plan, to show how they're applying fertilizers in a way that's protective of water quality. The Tier 1 and Tier 2 dischargers have to submit annual monitoring reports. They're due on March 1st each year. Attachment B of the general order provides the monitoring and reporting program. And it's important to remember that the MRP can be revised by a Regional Water Board executive officer based on site-specific conditions if needed. So some kind of important reminders of what I've gone over. All commercial cannabis activities are required to apply for registration or enrollment status under the general order. If you're an existing enrollee in either the Region 1 or Region 5 orders, North Coast or Central Valley, you're required to enroll under the statewide general order, and we provide a transition period for those enrollees to transition by July 1st, 2018. There will be some cultivators who were previously exempt under Region 1 and Region 5 that will be required to register or potentially enroll under the general order. But it's important to realize they have to do something anyway because they need to get the license from the cultivation license from CDFA, and CDFA requires compliance with the water board requirements. All the applications will be online through the internet, and technical reports are due 90 days after the application is submitted, and self-monitoring reports are due March 1st annually. And at this point, I will hand it back to Dan or Aaron.
Thanks, Tim. So going to just briefly discuss the small irrigation and use registration program. The State Water Board is working on, Division of Water Rights is working on a statewide cannabis small irrigation and use registration that would allow cannabis cultivators to come in and get a storage permit. So recognizing that there's a forbearance period that is going to be required under the policy, there's a need for folks to be able to have storage. And so this small irrigation and use registration will serve as a vehicle for that. It's envisioned that the same conditions that are adopted as part of any policy would apply to the registration program as well. So the same conditions that are in attachment A of the policy would be the general conditions that would serve for the small irrigation and use registration for the statewide cannabis program. There are some filing requirements in place right now for cannabis cultivators. So in order to get a California Department of Food and Agriculture license, you need to be able to prove that you have a valid water right if you're diverting from a surface water body. So currently there are forms that they can fill out in order to recognize that they are diverting water for purposes of cannabis cultivation and use them in the interim period of time until the small irrigation use registration program is up and running. Just want to touch briefly on outreach and coordination that we've had relative to the development of the policy. So we've been working with a variety of different state agencies. The primary state agencies we've been working with are the Regional Water Quality Control Boards, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Food and Agriculture, and the Department of Pesticide Regulation. We've also been in meetings and coordinated with the Bureau, the new Bureau for Cannabis, as well as the California Department of Public Health. So kicking things off, Senate Bill 837 was passed in June of 2016. In August, we started doing public outreach relative to the fact that we were going to be developing a policy. And so we held 8 meetings throughout the state to get early input on the policy. We also attended meetings oftentimes with the Office of Enforcement so that they could discuss their program and we could talk about what we were doing relative to the development of a policy. With local agencies, we met with Humboldt County, a variety of venues. You'll see Siskiyou County Board of Supervisors and the Calaveras County Water District. We also attended the North Coast Regional Water Board meeting at their invitation in October to talk about what we're doing relative to cannabis cultivation. And then when we had other venues and opportunities to provide input on or provide information about what we were doing and solicit input, we did that as well. So we had a meeting in Bryceland for the California Water Action Plan relative to our work in the South Fork Eel. That seemed like a really good fit to be talking about the policy as well. So in addition to that, we also had meetings with the Association of California Water Agencies, Northern California Water Association, Farm Bureau, wine stakeholders, and water rights stakeholders in May to give them a preview of what we were anticipating with the policy and hear any feedback that they had for us at that time. And then we've been participating, working with the California Department of Food and Agriculture to attend their public meetings so that when folks have questions about our program, we're right there and can answer those questions directly with those folks. And we've had a lot of outreach with the California Growers Association. We've attended a few of their meetings over the past year as well. We also...
One question going back to the slide. You recently did a couple of outreach workshops as well, staff workshops. What kind of a turnout did you have for those?
So in the Eureka meeting, we had, I think, about 50 people who attended that meeting. Growers, consultants up in that area. So it was well attended from the perspective of not as many people, but the meeting started at 4 p.m. It was scheduled to go till 6, and we left slightly before 8 in terms of wrapping up and answering questions. There was a lot of interest. It was a real benefit, I think, to get out there and talk with those folks. We also had local agencies in the area that are very familiar with what they've seen over the past few years with their permitting activities. And then we had the one here in Sacramento. It was probably between 30 and 50 people too, I'd say, and that one was webcast, and we got questions from the web as well as from folks in the audience. So we also have reached out to tribes. We sent a letter to all tribes statewide letting them know about the policy and seeking early input. We received 16 comment letters and are working with 5 tribes that requested consultation. So we now have the draft policy out there, so we'll be able to have more detailed conversations with them about what they like or don't like about the policy and solicit that input. We have provisions that say that there's no cultivation on tribal lands unless you have the express written permission of the council at this point in time in the policy, and there's some other protective measures related to tribal resources. So this is the list of folks that are the main contacts for this effort. You'll see up there at the top for small irrigation and use registrations, Sean McGuire's group in the Division of Water Rights is overseeing that effort. Tim O'Brien and Kevin Porzio are working on the general order out of the Division of Water Quality. Dan Schultz has the lead on the cannabis cultivation policy, and Yvonne has been working in the trenches on cannabis cultivation probably the longest, I'd say, at the State Water Board, so she's got a wealth of knowledge in the Office of Enforcement as part of the coordinated effort between the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the State Water Board as part of the watershed enforcement teams that they have out there, and working directly with Regions 5 and Region 1 on their permitting programs, so they have a really good understanding of what is working and what they're seeing out there in the real world. And with that, we'll defer to the board as to whether or not you want to ask questions or move to comment period.
Thank you so much. I mean, thanks for that, and thank you for all of the work. I want to open it to our initial questions before we take a break, before we get to public comment. We don't have any cards yet, but we have people who don't regularly go to our meetings. So what I neglected to remind folks at the beginning of is that we have blue cards at the back of the room, which you need to fill out if you'd like to speak. And I need to know during the break if you can fill them out if you're going to speak, so that we know how much time we can allocate to each person, have a sense of that. So I encourage folks who want to help us in the at this stage in the proceedings to fill out a card during the break and give it to Janine Townsend before we come back. Questions, though, first.
Just generally, when it came to the workshops and stakeholder engagement, was there one question or sort of a category of questions that was recurring or otherwise was pretty well shared?
Yeah, I'll do an easy one. I'll let Tim potentially talk about another one. So a lot of folks are recognizing the fact that we have two permitting processes already in place with the Central Valley and the North Coast. And so wondering, what does that really mean in terms of what's going to happen with those permits? And the fact that they're going to have to transition by July 1st of 2018 into this program. What does that mean with respect to fees? What does that mean with respect to existing projects that they already have in the ground, and the requirements that are in the policy, the proposed policy that we have forward right now. So there's general discussion or questions about what are the logistics associated with that, and how does this impact my existing grow site that's already permitted, and I've already spent a bunch of time and effort getting it permitted. And so there are some differences in terms of the provisions related to setbacks and disturbed area, and how those things are looked at across developing a statewide program as opposed to the regional programs, because each region developed what they thought was appropriate at the time.
Well, and presumably in developing your rules, you've taken, or I think from the beginning, taken what you've seen as from those permits as a base, and then figured out how to make it applicable.
Correct.
In a broad way that can be implemented quickly, because time is of the essence in getting ahead of this wave.
Right, and I don't know that we actually said that, but there is this huge push to have this program in place and to have a regulatory framework in place before January 1st of 2018, because that's when California Department of Food and Agriculture's licensing program goes into effect. And so we need to have folks, give them the ability to come in and get their permits, whether it's for water rights, waste discharge requirements, so that they can be in line and pursue that license with the California Department of Food and Agriculture.
I'll add just a few things to that. One of the things that came up in Eureka and also in Sacramento was discussion of roads, legacy roads and new roads, and how would they be addressed in the order. Another topic was technical reports. Apparently, there's a real problem in hiring qualified people to prepare the reports. And so the general order, as I mentioned, has a 90-day deliverable due date. They didn't think that schedule was very realistic given the constraints of what's available there. There were questions about third parties. Would a third party be allowed to go online and apply for the discharger? And also, would coalitions be allowed under this general order? The short answer is third parties are allowed under the general order, but coalitions are not addressed in this general order.
I assume that's the right answer.
There were some issues. I think Aaron touched on it, the forbearance. They had some concerns about that. And then there were some county representatives who were concerned about the change in regulatory structure from the regional board to the general order and how it might create problems for growers. And they were especially concerned on the potential economic impact of changes to the regulatory structure. So we've tried to include that issue about transitioning from other orders to our order in the statewide general order to make it as smooth as possible. They're concerned about fees and things like that. And we have all that addressed really in the general order.
I should mention that we have a fact sheet available for the policy and general order right now, but we will be developing frequently asked questions based upon what
I
we...
assume you're amassing quite a list.
Right.
Did you get, we made today, did you get questions or input from other agricultural permittees, folks who were worried about the level playing field and this new industry waving in?
We didn't...
And making sure that the rules are fair as between, I think about all the people who've spent years working through their permits with us. And so, as I understand it, you're trying to do state-of-the-art here so that it is absolutely fair as between the growers, but also as these growers to other growers, let alone communities and fish and wildlife.
There were questions about why cannabis is being treated differently than other crops. And we have a mandate associated with development of this policy that is specific to cannabis cultivation, along with the fact that cannabis cultivation is being grown in a very different way than we see traditional ag growing for the most part, and the impacts that we're seeing associated with it are different than what we see with traditional ag. And as I mentioned, this is an interim, this is our first policy. This is an interim policy. And as we see things shift over time, and we may see folks move down more into traditional ag lands, and we may see that the impacts are different than what we are seeing right now. And we'll have to see over time whether or not it makes sense for this program to move into in some cases, into an irrigated lands type of regulatory program. There are provisions that allow for that, but they still need to meet the same requirements under the policy. So it doesn't provide any sort of difference in terms of the level of requirements associated with cannabis cultivation.
That was the area that I wanted to explore a little bit, and that is the comparison between the two programs, recognizing that regions have their own programs for irrigated lands. And there is on slide 27, a bullet that says recognizes other permitting requirements that apply, but does not implement those requirements. So just asking for a little clarification as to what you mean in light of the fact that this is a separate program from the regional irrigated lands regulatory program that cultivators would otherwise be subject to.
Right. So there are other permits that are likely to be required. For example, construction stormwater.
Oh, sure. Right.
Those sorts of things we can't include in this general order. There could be timber permit issues as well. So it's a little bit hard to forecast everything that might be required, even waste discharge requirements for wastewater discharges as well. That's another possibility.
So it doesn't supersede those, it just doesn't implement them.
That's correct. It recognizes them, and that's it. And then with regard to the ILRP, the order actually allows for regions, if they want to develop an ILRP WDR to address cannabis. There were two regions, Region 3 and Region 9, that expressed interest in that especially. And as Aaron said, whatever that WDR is that they may develop, it'll have to comply with the policy requirements that are included here.
Right. Okay. And let's take a region that doesn't explore that option. And you have here a number of things that, requirements that we would normally see in an irrigated lands program anyway. For example, monitoring, reporting. And in light of the fact that the irrigated lands programs are evolving, with each passing year, we get better information, better science, more information about plant uptake. How do you propose keeping these requirements sort of state-of-the-art in terms of not just the evolving information and research, but also the changes that the regions implement in order to incorporate the changing science?
So maybe I'll take a stab at that. So as Aaron has said repeatedly, this is an interim policy. We expect this policy to change over time, and the policy then cascades into the requirements of the waste discharge requirements. So we do expect over time to have changes in the requirements essentially in Table A, which would then be reflected down into the waste discharge requirements. I did want to touch on your issue of the irrigated lands. We had many discussions on that, and the concept would be if a existing irrigated lands program, let's theoretically talk about Region Z, and they've got an irrigated lands program, they could add in their adoption a section for cultivation of cannabis, and as long as that section met all the requirements in the policy, then they could have folks enroll under that program as opposed to the under our registration, and we would work through the process of getting that approved for CDFA in the same way. Right now, there are no irrigated lands programs that meet the requirements today, but they could change over time.
So essentially, this permit, in order get something in place in time, and then regional boards have the time to do that if they want to.
Exactly, and I see this really as a policy for water quality control, like many other policies for water quality control, and so when it's adopted, those requirements are applicable to anyone that meets the requirements, meets the definitions, which would be cannabis cultivators, and so the implementing mechanism, we're proposing one now so that people can get enrolled now, but regional boards always have the option of working through a different mechanism as long as it meets all the requirements there.
Okay, that helps. And then question regarding other programs and the applicability or any cross-referencing that you have in the policy or Q&A as part of the outreach on SB 88, measurement and reporting, and SGMA.
So we have specific monitoring requirements associated with the diversion of water, primarily that you need to record and have records for what you're diverting and what you're using for cannabis cultivation. So similar to SB 88, and we specifically looked at making sure we were being consistent with the technologies and things that are available through SB 88 as part of development of the policy. With respect to SGMA, that's been an ongoing topic that has come up. SGMA has priority basins throughout the state, so not all areas of the state are covered under SGMA. There's been a discussion about how cannabis cultivators are going to tie in when there is a SGMA basin, because the California Department of Food and Agriculture in their draft regulations has provisions that they'll require identification of what the water source is, so we'll know who's using groundwater wells and where those wells are located. So I would see over time in SGMA basins that there would be potentially outreach by those groups to figure out how they want to pull in, cannabis cultivators using groundwater wells just like others in those jurisdictions that are using groundwater wells.
Okay, and then Mr. O'Brien, you brought up legacy impacts, roads, for example. How does the policy deal with that issue?
Yeah, the roads are problematic, and for those people who have been going out and doing inspections, they tend to say that the roads are actually the biggest sources of problems. The order as it exists right now doesn't include a definition of access road. It's a topic, as I mentioned earlier, comes up frequently at these the public meetings. But the order does include a definition of discharger that includes someone who's building roads or allowing cultivate cannabis products to traverse the road. And so the order, the way we see it now is those road owners who may be otherwise uninvolved in cannabis cultivation activities may be subject to the order. But at this point, we know that it's an issue, so we're really hoping to get some comments so we can clarify the message and the order.
So let me add to that, because there is also a provision in for the Region 1. Region 1 has a basin plan amendment which talks about parcel-wide impacts. We discussed this yesterday, actually, and it recognizes that that exists, and that sources of sediment on a property, a legacy road that may not be associated with the cultivars, can be addressed by the regional board through enforcement actions. Also, regional boards always have the ability to issue enforcement action to property owners if there's a ongoing source of discharge on their site. So it requires roads that are built or modified for cannabis activities to meet all the road requirements in the permit and all the BMPs, and then it is really a regional board discretion on legacy sources on the site.
So just so I'm clear, because now I'm confused a little bit, there is a road section in here,
Yes.
Yes, there
and
is.
it requires that the roads,
Roads associated with the either development of those roads or maintenance of those roads that are associated with the cannabis activity have to meet all the requirements. It does not require a road that happens to be on the property that was built for a logging activity 50 years ago necessarily has to meet those requirements, but the regional board will make a determination based on prioritization of the impacts.
okay, now I understand better. Okay, I was going another place. That's what I thought.
Okay, and then on slide 9, I thought this was an interesting slide that showed the increased sites between 2009 and 2012. And just curious if you have information as to the type of site. So is this increase primarily greenhouses, primarily land cultivation, or a mixture? Do you happen to know?
Yeah, we're seeing a mixture. You can see on this particular map, the greenhouses are in the blue and the outdoor are in the red. And generally speaking, we're seeing a combination of both on most sites in the North Coast area. The characteristics of the cultivations kind of change throughout the state, but in the North Coast, in these areas, we're seeing a lot of explosive growth. We're getting both outdoor and some greenhouse grows with starters and light deprivation and things along those lines.
Okay, and then last question has to do with greenhouses. I think, Mr. O'Brien, you mentioned primarily the focus of the WDR, or your description primarily, at least at the beginning of your comments, was related to cultivated sites. So could you talk a little bit about waste discharge requirements for greenhouses and any distinction between the two types of operations?
Yeah, so it's kind of the distinction between indoor and outdoor grow. And so if it's a greenhouse that, for example, has a plastic film, a hoop house, as you see, and they're actually cultivating the crop on a ground or floor in the earth, commonly is performed, then that would be considered an outdoor grow from the order's perspective. An indoor grow has relatively specific criteria. It has to be within a permanent building with a permanent roof and a permanent, relatively impermeable floor. So we're really talking in those cases about cultivation activities that are performed in warehouses and things like that. And then the indoor grows, these truly indoor grows at warehouses, that fall into two categories. There's either a discharge, because they still they generate wastewater. Hydroponic cultivation generates wastewater, so they have to do something with that. So if it's an indoor grow and it discharges that wastewater to a community collection system, and that activity is permitted by the local wastewater treatment facility operator, and it complies with the facility operator's requirements, then it's exempt from the general orders, but we still want them to register so that we know who they are and where they are. And then...
Well, and also so you have a record that they say they have a permit that you can double check.
Right, and in addition, they need to register with us so that they can get that CDFA cultivation license. And then the other situation is where it's a warehouse grow, but they discharge to an on-site wastewater treatment system. And so that's a different thing. That discharge of wastewater to that on-site system will require waste discharge requirements.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Other question for now? All right, we will now take a 15-minute break. It says 10:39. Let's say we'll come back at 10:55. And if you wish to speak, please fill out a card. It'll, depending on the number, it'll be 3 minutes or 5 minutes, just so you know for your planning. All right, see you in a little while.
There's two issues. This one fell, one. I can do this with Phil. I'm here. I'd actually like to be on both. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And I trust we'll also get lots of written comments to help us with this as time goes on. We have 5 speakers, so I'm going to make it 5 minutes each. Some have only asked for 2 or 3. That's just fine. We found that fewer is just as effective, but if you want 5, that is just fine. And I'll tell you who all of you are and then just read a couple off as we go through, but so you can get ready for your order. Tish Espinoza from the Cali Consulting Service. Deidre Brower from Downriver Consulting for the Cultivator. Tom Belanco from Harmonic Engineering. That's a great title. Mary Matava from AgriService Inc. Dale Schaefer. Okay, so you know the order. All right, Ms. Espinoza, followed by Ms. Brower. Hi.
I just wanted to thank you guys for, taking the time to put this general order together. That basically, I'm a consultant with conventional agricultural crops. And so basically, I've also been getting a lot of calls on producers wanting to kind of just veer off and do something different and, kind of change their ways. But just wanted to thank you guys for doing this in such a fast manner. And, I've been working with the general orders with the dairies since 2005 or whatever, and then the irrigated lands. And so I do, realize these are all going to change and evolve as things go. But one thing that really concerns me is I look at, what's happening up at the North Coast, and they, have been growing up there for a long time, a lot longer than, some of the stuff going on down in the Central Valley. However, I look at some of those photos you were showing. If those were producers down outside of the Central Valley trying to grow a conventional agricultural crop, they'd have had cease and desist. They'd have been shut down for pulling trees without, Migratory Bird Treaty Act surveys. They would have had, wetlands dinged. They would, it's just amazing what's going on in some of those areas compared to cropping, down in the Central Valley. And so, I just would like to just comment a little bit on the fact that I think, it's really going to be important getting the word out to all these, growers, because you do have your legitimate growers that are going to go and get your permits and do the right thing, but then you also have those that are just going to go Wild West and do what they want. But, we got to remember it is those natural resources that we have to protect, our creeks, rivers, waterways, wetlands, species, critters, threatened, endangered, all of those. And I just don't see a lot of that really being addressed in these orders as much as I would when it comes to like our Central Valley farmers and stuff down here. And I just have this, thing that if you're going to allow them to clear cut trees and do stuff, other crops are going to start moving up into some of those areas also, or they're going to keep expanding because they're not being regulated like our traditional agricultural crops are. When it comes to needing surveys for taking trees down, surveys for wetlands prior to moving dirt, surveys for putting in roads and culverts and all those things you guys are addressing. I mean, these are crop conversions going on in a natural area. And it all needs to be addressed just like you would a regular agricultural.
Right, that's being addressed separately. We do have an enforcement action. We never have enough staff. This budget gives us a lot more staff for enforcement, but this doesn't legitimize any of those things that are illegal.
I understand, but those are all things that are
It's a right point.
Be, tweaking and adding into this general order as it changes and your cultivation policy, because I see there's just a little disconnect when it comes to what you're presenting, because you're talking about stream diversions. Well, all of a sudden someone's going to think, whoa, I can divert that, well, no, there's a lot of hoops you got to jump through to get that water out of that stream or creek or whatever. And it's almost making it sound like you're going to make it real easy to divert water and all this. And they got to know that if they don't have a well, it's going to take months, possibly years, to divert that water out of a stream legally with a permit. And, that's the thing, is they got to, be planning ahead and knowing all of this stuff, that it's not just can apply for a permit and get that diversion, right there to irrigate our crop. Those are all things that, it has to go through Fish and Game, or, Cal Fish and Wildlife now, and, the whole process. And it just makes it sound like it's kind of the way you're presenting it, it's going to be real simple. And, you know, it's not like that, I would think, you know, when it comes to traditional crops, and that they shouldn't get, you know, a little special treatment for being in the hills and, you know, producing a smaller crop production, a footprint of 2,000 feet or less. It's still nitrates, you know, all the
Right.
different stuff are still downhill. So I just wanted to say thank you, and I appreciate what you're doing, but I'm getting a lot of calls on people wanting to switch crops and doing stuff, and yeah, it's very confusing. It is.
One thing is, because there are separate enforcement actions, and this is going to be harder than what someone would get going through the longer process. If you could submit all those questions, that will help Aaron and the team come up with the right FAQs.
Thank you.
That's also part of why I asked how many people were at the other meetings, because getting the word out is very important. Ms. Brower, followed by Mr. Blanco.
Hi, thanks for being here today. I represent a lot of cultivators up in the North Coast region, primarily Trinity County, and so we've been working through the North Coast Regional Order for about 1.5 years, 2 years now, and thankfully it's cleaned a lot of things up and it helped educate people. There are 3 main points that I would like to address in this statewide order. One is the forbearance period and allowing farmers to a little bit of time to come into compliance while they get their storage in place. The second is a lack of licensed professionals. I know this gentleman over here, or I believe, or Aaron mentioned earlier, that was some of the comments, and a lot of the engineers that we work with come from outside of the county, and it is hard. That would be a tough timeline to meet on some of those reports. And the third comment was that a lot of people that have been enrolled in the North Coast Regional Order for, they're on their 2nd year now, have invested a lot of money, in some cases in the 6 figures, to get into compliance with those setbacks and those requirements. And if there's any way to allow some of those early movers a little bit of allowance or grandfathering in on some of the things. But I appreciate all the outreach that you guys do as an agency also.
Can you help me understand what some of the differences are between the orders that would make it so hard to adjust?
Some of the setback limitations from surface waters, they've expanded that distance that needs to be, that gardens need to be away in the new order, is the primary. And then the forbearance period, you were allowed to use surface water as a Tier 2 on the North Coast Board during, well, all year really, and now you're required to forbear from April 1st to October 31st. So there's a lot of storage that needs to get in place. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for flagging. Mr. Blanco, followed by Ms. Matava.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. Thank you, so many of you, for being here. I'm happy to see that. My name is Tom Blanco. I'm also from the North Coast region. I live in Trinity County. I have the distinction, dubious or otherwise, of being the first enrollee under the North Coast Order. We enrolled I think the governor signed the then MRSA Act on the Friday before Columbus Day weekend, which it's an odd day for news, but anyway.
It's also an odd acronym. I'm glad they've changed it.
Me too.
I didn't like that.
So we enrolled the following business day. I thought we would be, somewhere in on the list. Little did we expect, for almost 2 months we were there alone as the only enrollees. That doesn't make us the best cannabis farm in the state. I unfortunately say that we're probably far from it. But it does make us the one that's been working with a water board for the longest. So in the almost 2 years since that time, I've come to learn things that I didn't know, like having roads hydraulically disconnected. Didn't know what those terms meant. Now all my roads are hydraulically disconnected. All our petroleum and fertilizer have secondary containment. These are things that came from that North Coast Order. We're implementing a water resource protection plan, as that order calls it. And it was a 5-year plan. We're on our way. We've got other things to do. We've done the major things. We've also been able to work in our own watershed, basically instigated by the North Coast Plan. There are 9 properties in our little watershed. We have Indian Creek flow is a tributary to the Trinity River. It is an anadromous stream. There are 9 properties with riparian rights on it. Of those 9, 5 of us actually divert. Of those 5, 3 of us are cannabis cultivators. All of us are enrolled. We're all signed up with our county local permitting program. And so we've been able to have coordination about our diversion rates. And were this order to be adopted as written, the forbearance period particularly would be devastating for us. And I understand why it's important. I just think it might be an overfix. For instance, all of us, if all 3 cannabis cultivators on Indian Creek all operated our pumps at the maximum each of our 1,600 permits allows, which is 10 gallons per minute, that's 30 gallons per minute if we were all doing it all at the same time. And the flow, we had our local watershed center came out and measured, our property is the furthest upstream. They measured the flow at the lowest point in the drought, which for us was 2014 as far as our stream level. I know 2015 hit more statewide, but in our little microclimate there, 2014 was the lowest, and we had 2,000 GPM, and I marked that on the creek. But let's just say if it was 20,000, or excuse me, 2,000 GPM, my mistake. If it was 2,000 GPM, all of us cannabis diverters constantly diverting 30 GPM. That's a 1.5% reduction of the flow. Now, I'm not saying that might not have impact on in-stream flow, and I understand that there are a lot of scientific and measurements that go into such a thing. But by disallowing us the ability to divert in the summer months, we're out. We're in a mountainous terrain, so there's no place to put storage that's off-stream. All of our storage would be considered in-stream storage because even a draw in this area would be considered a class 3. It would take me 60 tanks, 65,000 gallon tanks, which would have a awkward impact if I'd have to clear a road to get to them and a terrace to put them on. So what I'm saying is just, I'd like to see the regional boards retain enough flexibility to make site-specific, if it's independent WDRs or whether they can, at least in the North Coast, operate under the existing order. Certainly the majority of cultivators are not moving towards compliance, and that's more of an enforcement program. I understand that. But for those of us that are, we want to be partners in stewardship with you.
No, keep finishing. Finish your thought. No, go ahead.
So we want to stay involved in this bit of agriculture. I understand maybe 20 years down the road, this is all going to move to our more traditional locations. But for the last 20 or 30 years, it's been largely focused in the North Coast. Not asking for special allowances, but I am asking for maybe some closer peaks at different watershed compliance abilities so that we are actually getting a real world picture of what the impacts may or may not be. And where they are there, obviously you've got to limit what's being done. But where they're less, a little more flexibility would be helpful.
All right, thank you. That's
Thank you.
a very good point and very helpful. I'm assuming you'll suggest mechanisms for that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in your comments. Appreciate it. Ms. Matava, followed by Ms. or Mr. Schaefer. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for the meeting today. It's been really helpful. A couple of comments. I'm from San Diego County and have worked in the agricultural arena for nearly 40 years down there, first as having a testing lab, and currently have a small farm that was and have been toying with the idea of converting over to growing cannabis. So some of the questions that I have is like this interface between the irrigated lands and why this is completely separated out from traditional agriculture and not included in the irrigated lands group. Spending a little bit more time with that. I also was a little bit confused by, or didn't really understand what you're looking for in a nitrogen management plan. One of the issues with this crop is that there hasn't been a lot of university research done. And so tying it together and coming up with a comprehensive plan that is beneficial to the environment, I think would be really important. And last but not least, it would have been really helpful because there is a lot of interest in San Diego County since our water costs are so high. They're nearly $2,000 an acre foot
Right.
for agricultural water in some areas. So this is a crop that makes sense. And at that kind of rate. And there haven't been any of the workshops, really any place in Southern California. And I don't know about you guys, but getting from San Diego to Eureka is quite a challenge for a 2-hour meeting. So thank you very much.
Good, that's a good suggestion. Do you want to try and give any answers to illuminate that? And we have a little bit of time.
Sure. For the first question on the agricultural issue, first, we have specific legislation, so we are treating it, they have specific requirements, and so we are treating it differently because of that specific legislation. We do contemplate that that in the future, as I mentioned earlier, there may be regional boards that want to consolidate their irrigated lands and their cannabis into one regulatory program, and the policy and the contemplates that could happen, but that permit would have to meet all the requirements in the policy. And so I don't know if there's anything else I can say on that. In terms of outreach, we focused our outreach on the areas that were having active cannabis activity now, as opposed to we didn't necessarily go statewide. I can talk to the team and we can see if maybe a Southern California meeting to solicit comments. I can see how happy they are about that with their time frame.
But don't you want to go to Southern California? You go to Disneyland, for heaven's sakes. SeaWorld, or, the zoo, whatever. Sorry.
And I'm sorry, I don't remember the third. Nitrogen management plans. Yes, nitrogen management for cannabis is going to start initially the same way it started in irrigated lands, which is where there isn't information about uptake and things like that. There is going to be information about application and removal. Is there anything else you want to jump in there?
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things about the nitrogen management plan. The commenter was correct. There isn't a lot of research about the nitrogen uptake of cannabis. We were only able to find one reliable document, and that was for hemp, not growing cannabis for flowers, basically. So we took that data and then we looked at it and we said, okay, we anticipate that there probably will be more nitrogen taken up by recreational medical cannabis than for growing for hemp. When you grow for hemp, you're basically growing the stalks, you're not growing the flowers. So we took that, we added a factor to that, and then we also included a procedure whereby a grower, if they still believe that using the base level with the multiplication factor still was not applying enough nitrogen, they could do a study. They could take plant clippings, bring it to an agricultural lab, and do a nitrogen study to determine whether or not the crop is in fact nitrogen short. And then in terms of the lack of nitrogen, the nitrogen management plan guidance, there actually is an attachment in the general order that describes what it is we're looking for. It even includes how to calculate the nitrogen loading. So
We're doing this all over the state, so
yeah,
it's not a new idea.
yeah.
No,
So
it's evolving, but it's not new. All right, that's helpful. Thank you. Dale Schaefer? Mr. Schaefer?
to all. Good morning. Thank you. One of my comment and my concern involves a license type here in California for cultivation, which is called mixed light. These generally recovers in the ground cultivation, which is traditionally outdoor. It also mentions indoor, which is full light, typically has a non-permeable floor to it. I'm an attorney consulted by people in the industry quite frequently, and some of the questions involve mixed light now that the order is coming out, and seems to be a hole in the middle of it about what to do with mixed light cultivation. It's not a full season in the ground, although some people will put them in the ground, and it's not indoors under light. It's something in between where they will do deprivation of light for gathering of natural light without having to pay for it, and they will put off flowering sometimes with supplemental light so they can have multiple crops a year. Now, one of the concerns I have is these are not done in traditional growing bags or in the ground because plants are moved around quite a bit. The movability means they go into smaller pots, so you have either artificial soil or they're set on ground or they're set into pans. If you have a closed loop hydroponic system, it's a different dynamic because it's a capture system that creates issues what to do with this wastewater if you can't dump it into a traditional treatment, a standard sewer line, if you will. There might be need to address what do you do with these, they may not be usable by any other industry, may have to be remediated. But if you have a floor that is potentially permeable, what can be done? Are there any ways to address how to go in and fix a greenhouse that you want to do light depro in, but you don't want it to permeate down into the ground where it may create issues of percolation, contamination of soils? Some discussion, if you will, about how to seal that floor, and then if you seal it and it's not a closed system, is there going to be tailwater? What can be done to address tailwater that might be coming off of that? Now, I don't have an answer for people that they ask me these questions, and I would like to have the board, perhaps with some regional boards and some local ag commissioners, building the planning commissions, try to give some guidance if someone's going to build ab initio or original construction, some guidance to get permits for local construction to make sure the floor is not permeable, and maybe you don't have to go the full 1 or 2 tier registration here, but register nonetheless, but not be as big a concern. And if it's already existing construction, what might be done for guidance for planners, for permit issuers, for construction people to go in and seal that floor and make it so that you're not going to have percolation into the groundwater and create problems. So.
Or be in a no person's land of not knowing what to do. How would that be handled in your view? Under the way it's currently written.
The order doesn't address light deprivation because that's kind of a growing technique that I guess it could have some impact on the amount of wastewater generated, but we didn't consider that at the time we drafted the order. But for a facility such as Mr. Schaefer described, with a relatively permeable floor or a permeable floor, that would be considered, the way the order is written, that would be an outdoor grow. Remember, the indoor grows have to be within a structure, permanent structure with a permanent roof and a permanent, relatively impermeable floor. That's the criteria. Everything else, there's a lot of, for example, hoop houses where
That's
they grow.
what you were saying in the beginning.
Yeah, where they grow either in the ground itself or in grow bags or in some other mechanism. And sometimes the material is actual soil, and sometimes it's some other growth medium. So there's different ways to look at it. So if the floor isn't relatively impermeable and it's not a permanent structure with a permanent roof, then that would be an outdoor grow. It would be subject to the requirements for outdoor grows.
And that's largely set back and the outdoor requirements in terms of water quality. Setbacks from There's the distance from
Yeah, so
the...
setbacks would be required in all of that. If it was large enough, they would have to do a nitrogen management plan. But we would evaluate it as, is this a tier 1 or tier 2, or is it conditionally exempt? It could fall under any of those levels.
Depending on size and slope.
Depending on the size. It'd be just like an outdoor grow, just how big is it, and we'll tell you which tier it is, or
Right, so really what we're getting at is there the potential to have impacts associated with the cannabis cultivation activities. So we don't get into the different types of lighting schemes that are available to growers. We look at, is there potential for discharge associated with the activity? And so if you have a mixed light facility that you're using to grow cannabis and it doesn't have an impermeable floor and it's not a permanent structure, then it, at this point in time, under the proposed policy and general order, it would fall under the purview of those requirements.
And how do those requirements deal with the groundwater issue as opposed to surface water contamination issue? I just haven't read the order.
Yeah, so the policy has requirements that look at prohibiting discharges to surface water as well as groundwater. So being in water rights, I talk a lot about surface water, but the general order is targeted at both surface water and groundwater discharges, the potential for both of those types of discharges, and has those BPTC elements to address both of those potential releases.
So is the concern that those create more requirements than folks using this sort of indoor-outdoor technique believe are necessary, that they're too onerous somehow for them?
Well, I don't give much credence to the complaining about restrictions being too onerous. The environment's being damaged horribly by cannabis cultivation. It needs to come into compliance. What I am more concerned about is guidance, if you will. People are going to invest potentially millions of dollars in facilities, and to have it then come back and be told, well, you didn't follow some general order or guidance if it doesn't exist. I understand the potential for percolation, or a cement slab is easy to deal with. But in between that, there are existing greenhouses they're modifying, and they're on bare ground. If you don't want to have to worry about percolation into the ground, then perhaps some thought to what can be done to create a non-permeable surface that you can set these pots on and make use of different techniques which are already being used, so that people will understand what is it we need to do to get the box checked off, or to not have them come back and say, well, gee, now you're going to be back charged or something because you have discharge in the soil that might have been anticipated. I just see a hole here that perhaps could be discussed more and some more guidance given.
Chair Marcus, for me, sorry. I just wanted to offer to meet with Mr. Schaefer to have a further discussion of what the concern is. I had a conversation we all had at both North Coast in here with some consultants and some people that are out in the field, and they have specific questions. So our suggestion to them was to set up a meeting with us during the comment period so we better understand the site-specific conditions that they're addressing, and to make a determination whether that triggers a need for modifying the order, or as was mentioned in here, there's looking for some best management practices that could be applied. I also wanted to mention in general, when we issue statewide orders for the purpose of use by the regional boards, the goal is to achieve consistency, and in this case also expeditious orders, as well as some streamlining. But we do recognize that there are cases that the regional boards may need to issue a site-specific order. Right. So that may be an avenue that may be open in cases where things don't fit into all one box that we have. If they meet the conditions, they could be permitted under this order. That's what the regions would use. But it is potential in some cases the regional board may determine a site-specific order is more appropriate to be more protective and also address the site.
So that could also help in the circumstance where someone already is more protective in some ways in terms of impact on the ground, as opposed to
correct
a general rule of thumb. All right. Well, those are all good issues for us to noodle and figure out vehicles to deal with. Are there other questions at the moment? Anything else you want to add before we take this all in and you continue your meetings with folks?
Please provide us your comments by noon on September 6th so that we can take them all into consideration as we develop the final policy, staff report, and general order for the board's consideration.
Terrific. And earlier is okay too. Great. All right. Well, thank you. That was very helpful. Appreciate all the hard work that everyone's doing on this. It's interesting. Sort of, we're trying to get ahead of the curve rather than catching up with it this time. So it's interesting.
So at this point in time, you would want to close the hearing.
I would like to close this hearing, or I hereby close this hearing, and we will adjourn to closed session as discussed yesterday, to discuss a personnel matter.
So, yeah, the other thing was
Oh,
item
board
number
member
9
reports.
was
I
the board
forgot.
wants to
Yeah, let's
resume
do
it.
board member reports. My apologies. Go ahead. Let me look at my calendar. Thank you, guys. We can let them file out for a minute, and then we'll.
I would just say that as the recipient of stern admonition from our acting executive director,
Yes.
I've been following his order in reducing my leave balance. Therefore, I have nothing further to report.
Okay, I just have one from yesterday when during the break I went and did a presentation before the Western Plant Health Association. This is a group of certified pest advisors, ag commissioners, consultants that work with product manufacturers, and I just kind of gave the basic rundown of water issues, irrigated lands to the extent that I could talk about it, the Bay Delta plan, but did spend a lot of time talking about affordable, safe drinking water and just really encouraging them. They're a little bit removed, but encouraged the association to work with other ag associations that are interested in getting a fix to this issue.
Oh, that's great.
I had the pleasure last week of accompanying Aaron Ragazian and Parker Thaler, I think is the last name, is our staff, up to Wairika to visit with the Shasta Indian Nation as part of their the board's tribal consultation with them in the CEQA process for potential dam removal in the Klamath Basin. And it was a great trip, and it's so much different when you're in the field there, actually seeing the landscape. It's one thing to read about the projects and the proposals and the history of the area, but far more impactful, obviously, to actually sit down and visit and really get to know the tribe and its long history in the area. So it was a pleasure.
Oh, it sounds great. All right. We're working on legislation, pretty much, and reading a lot of everything else I missed during all the water fix hearings. So, okay, with that, we will move into closed session.